an original MCM production.
I am pleased to announce that today we have two thoughtful state legislators who will discuss big picture criminal justice reform issues here in Wisconsin. Representatives Rob Hutton and Evan Goyke were elected to the State Assembly in the same year, in 2012. Both were reelected in 2014. Representative Hutton is a Republican who represents the 13th Assembly District, which includes Brookfield, Elm Grove, and parts of Wauwatosa, and a little bit of West Allis. Representative Goyke is a Democrat who represents the 18th Assembly District, which includes neighborhoods on the west and north sides of the city of Milwaukee. Representative Hutton has a background in business, while Representative Goyke has a legal background, including service as a state public defender. Both serve the state legislature on committees related to public safety, criminal justice, and corrections. Please welcome Representatives Rob Hutton and Evan Goyke. So in a few minutes, we'll obviously have a conversation about criminal justice reform and obviously save time for questions from the audience. But first, we'd like each representative to take a few minutes to introduce themselves and talk about their interest in this issue.
Well, Assistant DA Lovern, thank you for that introduction, and Representative Goyke for being a part of this panel discussion with me this afternoon. I thank you to the Rotary for inviting us here and allowing us to have some time to share with you some of the topics going on in Madison, today specifically around some areas of criminal justice and corrections reform. Those discussions tend to be both timely and difficult in lieu of the nightly news and the highlights that we all see from our comfortable sofas based on things that are happening, in my case east of me, and in some case based on where we're sitting today. Turn that on. There we go. There we go. In some cases, north of here or south of here, because we know today we are dealing with some serious issues in our city revolving around crime and justice. And those issues, as we talk about some broader concerns in a few minutes, I think for most of us would take precedence and would be first and foremost in our minds. And I think as we're looking at issues surrounding Madison, and in my case, more corrections reform type initiatives, I think we have to look at how do we deal with the here and now. How do we deal with what's happening in our cities currently today? How are we dealing with issues around dysfunctional families, kids growing up with absolutely no knowledge of who their fathers are, mothers who may be dealing with addictions, gang relationships, all of those issues that lead to this pipeline that we continue to have in our criminal justice system and eventually into our corrections area as well. So we know that heavy lifting is going on a daily basis with law enforcement between our city and between our sheriff's department at the county level. And so I think I would sit here this afternoon with Representative Goyke and applaud their efforts, because they are doing the heavy lifting to, in many cases, shield all of us from the crimes that are taking place in our city. But I would remind everybody that it's not only happening in our city. Without correcting those issues, we will continue to see the spread of those crimes, and in my case, to areas like Elm Grove. And I think when I say the name Elm Grove, most people would think of a very well-off community that is probably one of the safest in the entire state of Wisconsin. And yet, just as of last week, there was a violent break-in of one of our grocery stores, and their clients held at gunpoint. And I looked and talked to our city officials and village officials in Elm Grove who are astounded by the fact that in their little safe cocoon in a suburb of Milwaukee, they know that violent crime can happen there as well. So we know it's real here, it's real around southwest Wisconsin, and issues that need to be addressed. And so we'll talk a little bit about that here this afternoon. But I think as we're talking about key issues related to this, we need to make a priority around issues relative to crime and look at core reasons behind them to begin to address this issue long term.
Make sure I'm on. Good afternoon. Thank you for having both Representative Hutton and myself. Appreciate the time and the attention to this issue. I come from Madison, where I grew up. I was scared of Milwaukee until I came here in 2006 and moved into a small one-bedroom efficiency on 17th and Kilbourne as a first-year law student at Marquette University Law School. And when I moved in, I remained scared of Milwaukee until about October, and then I kind of found my way around the city, and I really fell in love with it. And I never really left the north side and the west side. So I'm a 2009 graduate of Marquette Law School. When I was graduating, I was begging Deputy District Attorney Kent Lovern for a job in the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office. Unfortunately, they didn't have a spot for me, so I switched sides and became a criminal defense lawyer with the State Public Defender's Office, which meant I was appointed by law to represent people charged with crimes that couldn't afford their own lawyer. Through that experience, on a case-by-case basis, I became frustrated. I would win a case, I would feel that we found resolution, and then there would be 3 new cases on my desk the next day. And so at a certain point, I grew very tired of that daily grind, and I decided to run for the state legislature to try to make policy changes at a higher elevation that would stop the system that I was entrenched in and that my clients were engulfed in. And I was elected in 2012 and initially thought that there would be no hope as a minority member in the state legislature that this issue, the criminal justice issues and reform issues, would have any audience, that they would fall on deaf ears. And then I met Rob Hutton. And
that confirmed his concern.
And a little pushing, a little pull. We have found that though we disagree on a vast majority of issues that are in front of the state legislature, and we very rarely vote the same way on the floor of the assembly, that this issue unites us. And just so that you know, my district on the west side includes where I live on 27th and State, part of Marquette's campus, west to the border of Tosa. So I like to say that I have green street signs and no blue street signs. Washington Park, Sherman Park, Washington Heights. Where my district ends to the west, Representative Hutton's begins. An entirely suburban district, an entirely urban district. My district's about 80% Democratic, and his might be 80% Republican, and yet we talk on a regular basis and collaborate on a regular basis on issues around justice reform, and it's been by far my most favorite issue to work on in the legislature, and there are great things ahead. It's that diverse background that I just want to highlight for 1 minute, so that there may be a number of you in this audience that would come today to this panel and think that you don't have any involvement in the justice system, or that is something that's far from you or from your community. But I'm hopeful that you leave today thinking something entirely different, that we are all invested in this system, and that if the two of us can come together and find agreement, that we can have that agreement as a broader community and as a broader audience. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you. So we know that obviously the legislature passes the laws that become essentially our crime laws in the state. But when we're talking about criminal justice reform here, we're talking about something broader than that, aren't we? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what we're really talking about is public safety. We're really talking about our return on investment. Justice reform is, and this is happening in all sectors of government, but it is, I think, maybe a little slower to happen in our justice system. We're taking a look at the structures that we've put in place and asking tough questions about whether they produce the outcome that we believe or that we intended them to create. Are we making our community safer with the laws that are on the books? Do we in our prosecution and our defense and with judges and probation and parole and our prison system, is that working? And what we find, and this is a common theme through states around the country, that there are some very simple common sense things that we could do to make the system work better. And by work better, I don't mean just saving money, but reduce recidivism, reduce crime, reduce victimization, increase public safety. And so all of those things are part of this conversation, but it starts with a very honest look in the mirror of, is what we're doing, does that make sense? And is it having the intended outcome?
Representative Hutton.
And I think as community leaders, and you are all from different segments of the community, I think what you ask of us as state legislators and lawmakers is to not shrink from bold concerns and bold areas within our community, and in our case, the state legislature. So I think bringing these issues forward and being brave enough to talk about them even on a bipartisan basis, and fundamentally asking the questions as we would with labor laws, as we would with other government agencies, how well are we doing in this sector? We have charged government with the idea around public safety, reducing crime. I think it warrants us, regardless of our political affiliation, to be able to step back and ask those questions. And I think that's to some degree what we are doing and have been doing over the last several months. We may look and say there are some very common sense reforms that can further our work along these areas, or we may say we're doing very well in most of the areas, let's go on to bigger fish somewhere else. But I think we have to be brave enough to ask the questions. And I think that is what's somewhat unique about this topic, because it has gained ground not only here in Wisconsin and in other states, but also at a federal level. And so much of the dialogue around criminal justice, quite frankly, came from the federal discussions, from federal officials in D.C. and elected officials and broad stakeholders around the spectrum. When you've got David Koch on one side of the issue talking about the need for criminal justice reform and discussion, and you have Van Jones or George Soros talking about this very same issue and sitting down at the same table saying, where are we today and can we do better? I think that's healthy for, in their case, the American public, and I think that's healthy for citizens here in the state of Wisconsin.
So what are some innovative things we're seeing coming out of other states or coming from that federal discussion that you just alluded to?
I think the discussions around the federal level are similar to what discussions we're having here. Again, we're, for the most part, you as business people, you in the nonprofit world, we really like to look at matrix and we like to look at results. And we like to look at return on the investment. And I think the people that are having those discussions at the federal level are asking those same questions. We've been on a trajectory over the last 20, 30 years of significantly elevating our level of incarceration. I think the questions now are, what has that done? What have the results been? Was our ultimate objective met in doing that? I think those questions now reside around, are there other avenues around criminal justice, around incarceration, around reentry, things that we haven't looked at in the past that can add and improve those matrix that, again, combined for the results that we're all looking for, and Representative Goyke listed those. I mean, safer communities, less victimization, less crime, better return on the investment, all of those scenarios that oil around those core issues in terms of what we all want to see from our criminal justice system and for our corrections agencies and departments, both here and around the country.
And one program that has been wildly successful in Wisconsin is called TAD, Treatment Alternatives and Diversions. A number of groups on the left and the right have talked about TAD, Treatment Alternative and Diversions. And the principle is simply to get as much information about the individual as possible. What is the cause? Why are they in the justice system in the first place? Is it a mental health illness? Is it a drug addiction? Is it both at the same time? Is it homelessness? Is it a lack of other opportunities or structures in their family? And what we learn when we really dig deep into that person's life is that we find that we have different interventions at our disposal that are more effective than a jail cell or a prison cell. And so what TAD does is say, well, if you have a drug addiction, you're not going to get much help behind bars. Let's put you in a treatment program, monitor you very closely with consequences holding over your head in the event that you fail, but give you a shot in the community instead of the reactionary prison sentence. And it's been very successful. And that is both in rural counties, in suburban counties, and here in Milwaukee. It's a program that started with a very few, 3 or 4 counties participating, and we're now, there are over 60 programs in the state. And I think what's happened based on the success of TAD is that the court system, both prosecutors, defense, judges, and legislators, are learning. The more we learn about each individual as they present themselves in front of the court, the better we can make those decisions. The more information we have, the better. And that's probably, I would imagine, consistent in many of your roles in the private sector. Information is good. It's 2015, we can handle data, we can track outcomes, and the better we do that in our justice system, the more we're finding that these non-prison interventions can be more effective than what we've been doing for the past several decades.
So what are some of these tools that you've referred to now that maybe we have today that we didn't have 10 years ago?
Well, I referred to the TAD programming. That can be a wide spectrum. And just to give you a sense of what we're doing here in Milwaukee County, we have a veterans treatment court. We have a drug treatment court. We have a pilot for a mental health court. We have what are called diversions and deferred prosecution agreements. And all of these things, and all of the different acronyms, basically stand for finding a different way to intervene in the individual's life that involves treatment or work or paying restitution or service before we put them in jail. And I don't want to say anything here today that would leave you with the impression that we are advocating for a system that would not include jail and prison as an appropriate intervention. There are people, and there will always be people that deserve to go to prison for a very long time. And that's an intervention that we need to have. That's a remedy that's necessary. But what we know is that it's not necessary for everyone. And we need to make sure that when we identify an individual that sentence is not appropriate, that we have in place resources that those alternatives are well funded, and that's what TAD does from the state. It funds programs here at the county, and they've been wildly successful.
And I think the encouraging part about some of those programs, to Representative Goyke's point, is we can be more intelligent about the treatments that we are assigning people. Along with those treatments come stricter accountability, and that means greater community safety, but also means greater opportunities for those people to have the opportunity to get treatment where they are and where they struggle, which leads to the change in behavior that ultimately leads to those people coming back to be contributing members to our society. A lot of things in our jail system and a lot of things in our prisons that are working very well relative to behavioral changes, I think we have ratcheted up another notch or two with some of these TAD programs that, again, lead to that change of behavior that we all want to see, that ultimately will reduce recidivism rates in our communities.
So you two are obviously leaders in the legislature around these issues. My question is, in this larger statewide community discussion, who are other people that are involved in this right now?
Well, I think because this is such a complex issue, and whether we're talking about criminal justice issues or whether we're talking about corrections issues, it is very complex, very wide, and very deep in terms of all of the entities involved. Representative Goyke has lived it to some degree on the professional realm. That's why I think it's so important that you identify all of those stakeholders and to ensure that those stakeholders, as we go about having these discussions, have a seat at the table. Because you're talking, as I referenced earlier, about law enforcement, you're talking about the judicial system and judges themselves, you're talking about victims, you're talking about families of those offenders. You've got a broad variety of individuals, either personally or professionally, that are impacted by these discussions. And I think as legislators, we are trying to be very careful that we don't get out in front and don't isolate and don't leave out anybody in those discussions, because I think that's critical to the success of these discussions and where we want to go, but it adds quality and depth to those individuals who have intimate and in-depth involvement on a day-to-day basis that need to have a stake at the discussion and say, have you considered, have you thought of, what about, to make sure that we are really covering our bases before we even take a half a step forward.
Well, and I'd just add, the justice system is a major contributor. And just to tell you, in my neighborhood where I live, 27th and State, the surrounding neighborhood is massively impacted, both by a high crime rate, but also by a high incarceration rate. And the individuals that come home to my neighborhood are not always ready for the workforce. What happens if they're not ready for the workforce? Or what happens if they have a felony conviction from a number of years ago? What is the ceiling of their earning potential? And can they ever really work themselves out of poverty? And I see on a daily basis this cycle repeating itself. And during our invocation today, and I was very moved and happy to hear reference to the children of those that are currently serving sentences, because especially for a boy, If his father goes to prison, statistically, that young boy is exponentially more likely to go to prison himself. And we know all of this stuff. We have the data that proves that that's true. So we need to now intervene and break that cycle. And so players in the workforce, in our education, all of the nonprofit world and those in social services are directly impacted by this, because we have thousands and thousands of people in Milwaukee that need a place to work and that may not be ready for the workplace, or may not, they may have this scarlet letter of a felony conviction that would prohibit them from that job, from that, upward mobility to really grow out of poverty.
So you've identified several stakeholders in this system and in this discussion. So my question is, how do you harness all of those people and all of those positions together in a process that can be meaningful and that can have a time frame?
Well, my guess is it probably won't happen in the next 30 minutes, Assistant DA. That is certainly, as we're talking about the magnitude of this discussion, one of the most difficult challenges, because not only do you have a lot of moving parts, you have a lot of different entities with a lot of different perspectives on this issue that make two, I will be self-effacing on my end, not on your end, two lowly legislators in the second term of their state assembly role being a part and leading this discussion. And yet the reality of it is, sitting out in the audience are individuals who have been involved in various discussions around community enterprise and community sustainability and dealing with ills in our community for years and years and years that are several miles, if not eons, ahead of at least where I am and probably where Representative Goyke is on this issue. So I would look to you as the audience, and those of you that are in the private sector that run businesses, those of you that are in the nonprofit world that have some footprint around needs in our community, around social services, to be asking yourself, what can you bring to the table on this issue? What background lends you to be a part of this discussion and a credible part of this discussion relative to solutions that you see that you're working on right now or that you've been involved in? Because we're going to need to, without a doubt, this discussion to rise above most of our heads from the state legislative side and say, as community leaders, you all understand the realities of what this looks like. You understand the impact not only today, but 10 years down the road, what it means to our corrections institutions if we don't begin to curtail the pipeline of individuals coming into corrections. What we will see and deal with if we don't deal with how to reunite the family unit in the city of Milwaukee, ensure that there is functional families that are not only surviving but thriving in the community. The faith-based community, which I know is also represented here today, you all need to, I would argue, say we're not going to stand by and let the state legislature figure this thing out. We're going to come alongside, or we're going to lead on this issue as community leaders and offer some broader strategy for long-term what this looks like and what this is going to mean. We're happy as legislators to come alongside you and say, we'll do what we need to do in terms of laws that offer the type of results that you all see and you all know that are validated. But that would be my request of those of you here today to really stand and say, we can't ignore this any longer. As a state budget, we are today spending more on corrections than we are on UW education. So if I ask you as a state budget, where does corrections fall? It's not in the top 20, it's not in the top 10, it's not in the top 5, it's in the top 3. And I think, again, as community leaders, you have to ask yourself, are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable with your tax dollars continuing to go to more and more incarceration with some change in trajectory that break the cycle of what we're seeing? So broad answer to the question is, I hope us being here provides some incentive and maybe even some renewed vigor for there to be a real collaborative effort in the city of Milwaukee and the entire state of Wisconsin to say, how do we take this and run with it and really do some meaningful things?
Be curious. This is an issue that takes some courage to really dig into. It is far easier, both as a legislator but as a community leader, to put the justice system at arm's length and to frame it in your mind as where bad people go and where people get locked up for doing bad things. And I can tell you that there are layers upon layers upon layers of intricacies within that system that are more complicated than just that 7-second news clip that we see at 10 o'clock. And my ask would be that you be curious, and then call me. I would love to show you my neighborhood and what it feels like. I would love to take you to Washington Park neighborhood in Milwaukee, where they've had a 30% reduction in crime. 30% in a neighborhood that has suffered a high crime rate for decades. And we can have a very serious conversation about why they did that. Why did they experience 30% reduction in crime? Why is my neighborhood trending in that right way? And what can we do as community stakeholders and policymakers to fuel that momentum in the right direction?
You both mentioned this, and I know a number of our members are concerned with how people who've been in the prison system can return to the community. How can they get back into being a part of this community with a job or in some productive fashion? What are the discussions around that issue in particular?
Boy, another one of those softball questions, right?
Easily answered, right?
Easily answered. As we look at our criminal justice system and we look at the pipeline of those coming and going within our, I'll say, Department of Corrections, whether it's in jail or our state prisons, we know there's two pipelines. We know there's the pipeline of those who are dealing with very difficult issues, have fallen into crime, and then we end up sending away to either a short-term or long-term prison or jail sentence. We know the other pipeline comes from those who have been involved in our corrections community for a while, have left and then recidivize and re-enter our corrections environment. I often call them the folks that we should give some frequent punch cards to, because unfortunately in many cases they're not one-time clients, they're repeated clients. We know there's significant issues around the issue of recidivism. Our current recidivism rates vary somewhere between 35 and 40%. Again, on a positive trajectory, but we've got a long way to go. So we know there are a number of factors around why people leave our corrections facilities and at some point in time recidivize and end back there. We know that within corrections there are certain things that people can do and accomplish, whether it's behavioral reforms, whether it's education, whether it's skilled trades, that better prepare them to come out and be, again, really contributing members to society. But we also know there are some shortcomings there, and we know we have some work to do to provide some quality services around those individuals to make sure, A, they're prepared to leave the institution, B, that they have some game plan for how they're going to leave and stay gone, and what that means in terms of support services around potentially mental health concerns, around reuniting in the community and with their family, and certainly last but not least, the whole issue of employment and occupation that allows them to sustain a lifestyle that deters them from going back into their former life just to sustain their income or to sustain a lifestyle. There is a chasm that still exists for a variety of reasons in our communities of trying to re-intersect those who are former offenders with the workforce. There are some things that are in our communities that, and by state law, that are inhibiting some of those individuals, but there are some very pragmatic concerns that still exist there that create that speed bump, if you will, that continue to prevent people from getting a meaningful, sustaining job. I'm encouraged, however, that through our Department of Corrections and through DWD and DOA, we're seeing some progress along that line. We've seen collaboration today with MATC and offenders that have just been released that right now in Milwaukee are taking courses in welding and CNC on a third shift basis at MATC over an elevated course to come out with a certified degree as a skilled trades operator of a welding machine or a CNC machine. DWD is doing a great job not only in facilitating that program, but also going to employers, and we know many of them in this community, that are begging for viable, qualified candidates that can show up and that can weld, that can show up and that can do carpentry work, that can show up and run a CNC machine. And so we're seeing placement successes with those individuals that are thrilled to say for the first time that they have some value in the community. They have some skill that is marketable. They have an employer that's willing to take a chance on them that can come in and being a contributing employer. Those come with a wide variety of challenges to those employers and to those employees, all things that are still being looked at and documented and figuring out how do we come along those employers to deal with unique issues of potentially mental illness, potentially addictions. What do we do to continue to support those individuals that are entering that workforce with what does it mean to show up on time? What does it mean to come to work at 7 a.m. when your shift starts? Many of those offenders have never even been in that environment. They have no idea what an alarm clock even looks like. So there are soft skills that need to be worked on with these individuals to make sure that not only do they have a skill, but they understand what it means to be a contributing employee by doing what most employees that we all take for granted show up and do for us every day.
You know, I agree with much of what Representative Hutton said regarding reentry. And part of my objective is to stop sending so many people to prison in the first place. I think it's very important that we have adequate resources on the back end of the system. The vast majority of folks in prison tonight will come home at some point. They will come home. So we have to have a plan and procedures in place so that when they come home, they don't go back. But we also have to have a very serious conversation, which we're having today, about how many folks we send to prison in the first place. Just imagine what it would be like to go to prison for a year. While back home, your kids are growing up without you, your partner may move on, the community, your employer. Life is happening and you're stuck in a small cell with no window. It's very, very hard to re-enter. It's incredibly hard to re-enter. And I would argue it's probably easier for us to just not have them enter. And that's not always possible. Some folks need to go. But if that's not necessary, we shouldn't be sending those people to prison in the first place, because it's just such a hard ask at the back end, because it is so incredibly. Just imagine if you were in Stanley Prison in Stanley, Wisconsin, and you're from Milwaukee. It's a 4-hour drive up, and you wouldn't see your family the whole time you're there. And you have to pay for your own phone calls. And so if you don't have money on your canteen account, you can't even call them. What would that be like, to only be able to write little handwritten notes in pencil to your family and watch them grow up without you? It's very hard to ask folks to re-enter, and we see very, very poor results with that. So I agree with that we can do some easy strategic things to get folks back into the workforce, to reduce recidivism. Nothing defeats criminal behavior like a job. But we also need to have this serious conversation about the front end of the system and who's going to prison and why in the first place.
And Representative Goyke and I probably differ on a few significant areas. This would certainly be one of them. And I so appreciate Representative Goyke's concerns relative to the infusion of residents into our prison system. And yet we know, certainly not because of any tough on crime legislation, but because of the environment within our communities, it's certainly very appropriate for certain sectors of our offender population to be removed from their communities and to be put in a facility that, quite frankly, I would argue in some cases is very beneficial to them. I visited 2 weeks ago with a gentleman that had spent 13 years in incarceration, just came back a few months ago. Part of that was in Wisconsin, part of that was in Oklahoma. He is now back, and I would argue is probably a more contributing member to our society than even I am today as a state legislature, which I think is a wonderful outcome that we need to not only applaud, but hopefully replicate more and more. But it was interesting to sit with him for 3 hours and just soak in what his experience was as a 15-year-old tried in adult court, sent to prison for 18 years, and what that means. What background he had as an upbringing to even get him involved in the criminal justice system, what experience he had in 18 years of incarceration, and what he's dealing with now, which is just as important, coming back to the community as a former felon and the hurdles that he's dealing with. But I thought it was very interesting that one of his points talking about this whole issue of incarceration revolved around the fact that what did you think of the fact that you were incarcerated? And his was multiple counts of armed robbery that eventually sent him there. And he said the interesting thing, Rob, for you guys to understand is if you talk to almost every inmate that I served with over that 18 years, every one of us, almost to a person, understood why we were there. We all understood that we committed offense that resulted in us being incarcerated. None of us really questioned that. We understood that we did the crime and we have to serve the time. And again, that's not an open window for us to be sending every single person in the crime system to our corrections facilities. But in his case, and along with his inmates, he knew that they really It warranted being them there. Their bigger issue was not why they were there and not that they had to serve the time. The biggest concern was, how do we change who we are? Because we eventually, in his case, will come back to your community. How do we deal with that? And how do we work through that transition so we can begin to rethink our life as a criminal, rethink our life as a member of the community, rethink what it means to be a contributing member to society, and eventually gain that dignity, in their case, as a young man that was stolen from us when we were 9, 10, 11 years old. He said, those are the issues that we grapple with inside the prison. He said, and I think that's where I would challenge you as a community to figure out, both inside our corrections facilities, when it's warranted, and in our process of transition, how you can help all of us succeed. Because in my case, meaning this gentleman, I didn't want to go back. And he said, I can guarantee you that when I came out, it was only weeks before I had every opportunity to reoffend and eventually go back. But he said, I wasn't interested in it. But I also knew I had challenges that as a community, if I can tap into, that can keep me accountable, to keep me out of the life of crime now that I'm back in that community, and it can eventually lead me to a life that I can be a contributing member, which, by the way, today they're leading programs for young kids of single moms and single dads and giving them jobs all summer long to give them a taste of what it means, even at the age of 8 or 9, to be that contributing member, something that he didn't have the privilege of experiencing. So he's doing those things now. And I think that is, again, good discussion for us to have as stakeholders in what's happening in our communities for how do we think in terms of those individuals transitioning, because as Representative Goyke said, roughly 98% of our prison population is coming back. That's a foregone conclusion.
Thank you, Representatives Hutton and Goyke, for a thought-provoking and presentation, and it's nice to see, people from both sides of the aisle finding sort of a common cause on that issue.
An MCM production.